There's your power on. Wait.
I am waiting.
Andrew is for you. Go.
No. There you go.
Go.
Try it. Is that alright?
Yeah. Let's go round first.
Yeah, send it all the way round.
Yes, then.
Oh, something's gone wrong. What's gone wrong?
I'll turn it over a bit so you can do it.
Ah, hello. What a wonderful hobby we have. Great fun. It seems as though the fascination with railways is going on forever. Although running a layout on the floor can produce a lot of pleasure, it isn't the right place. Locomotives pick up grit and carpet fluff. So get your layout off the floor. And the nearer you come to eye level, the better. Those who saw our previous program, A Line-Side Look at Model Railways, will remember that the layouts were produced by some very experienced modelers, an excellence which we can aim for. But in this program, we're going to look at building a layout on more simple lines. Before getting down to practicalities, let's look for a moment at where you might keep your layout once it's finished. Space being almost always at a premium with indoor layouts, it boils down to Z, N, or double O gauge is the only feasible proposition, with O gauge for those with a little more space. A spare bedroom is a good location if the model's not too large. This is a double O gauge layout and measures 4 foot by 2 foot. This is another double O gauge layout and features 2 scenes, a country scene and a town scene. It's built completely from off-the-shelf materials, kits, locos and rolling stock, and is not too large for either a loft space or even in the conservatory or garage. Collapsible legs make it easy to store away. In this program, Dave Lowry has once more taken stock items to make his layout. By the way, everything has been built in or around his garage, so we won't need an elaborate workshop. Let's get started. And first of all, we must have a plan of the whole layout. And here it is. It will incorporate 3 definable areas, 3 layouts if you like, all on one baseboard. The storage sidings at the top will actually form a mainline terminus, while the major part of the layout is a country scene purely for running trains through. The third portion on the right of the plan is the smallest area and will become a branch line terminus. The main theme of the whole layout is a modern image. So the first practical thing to do is to go to the timber yard and buy wood. Choose long, straight pieces without knots. Incidentally, all the measurements in this program are going to be given in inches, but to convert them is very simple. 1 foot is about 30 centimeters. So for the baseboard framework, we're going to need pieces of 4 by 1 inch. These will be the cross members, and we should have 2 pieces 2 foot 4 inches long and 4 pieces 3 foot 6 inches long. And you can see how these will be positioned to support the 8 foot by 4 foot sheet of half-inch chipboard. This will form the actual base of the track. Across these, we'll put 3 2 by 1 inch spars. 2 will be 8 feet long and the other 5 foot 8 inches. These will be let into the cross members later on. The whole baseboard framework will be supported on 2 sets of collapsible legs, and for these we'll need 4 pieces of 2 by 1 by 4 foot, 4 pieces of 2 by 1 by 2 foot, and 4 pieces of 1 by 1 by 4 foot as strengtheners. Note that we'll also require 4 3-inch hinges, 8 3-inch steel angles, and some screws. I said we won't need an elaborate workshop. Neither do we need an elaborate set of tools, but it's wise to have the right tool for the job. Say, a jigsaw, a drill, a 10-inch steel rule, pencil, set square, a craft knife, a screwdriver, a wood chisel, and a wooden mallet. And don't use the chisel as a screwdriver, and you'll need a suitable work surface too. So, to start, we'll mark up the slots in the cross members which will take the spars. Rather than a ruler, we'll use an off-cut piece of 2 by 1 to carefully mark up the cutouts 2 foot 3 inches from one end. Remember, planed wood is always slightly under its nominal size. 2 foot 3 inches from one end will be the position for the middle spar. It's a good idea to clearly mark the pieces to be removed. When you're cutting out the slots, allow for the thickness of the pencil by carefully cutting inside the marks. This will ensure a nice firm fit later on. Coming to the removal of the middle slot, keep the chisel slightly away from the pencil mark and then trim neatly to the line with a craft tool. Now it's a good idea to have a dry run, and if everything's okay, you'll find that the spars fit neatly and flush with the cross members. Worth checking now is the overall measurement of the 2 pairs of cross members. This should be 2 feet, and we'll see the reason for that later. Turning now to the legs, make a measurement of 2 feet to establish the position of the lower crosspiece. Mark up and cut out. Now we can assemble the leg, starting with the top cross piece, one of the 2 foot pieces. Drill, glue and screw a leg to each end. The glue is ordinary wood glue. Keep things in line by occasionally checking with a set square. The lower crosspiece should be cut to allow for the depth of the 2 cutouts. Before actually drilling and screwing, a little glue added in the joint will help to hold it together really firmly. Now you can see clearly how the legs have been assembled. The addition of the 1 by 1 will give added strength to the legs and avoid the danger of flexing. At this point you can add corner brackets, but they're not totally essential. Once the legs have been fixed to the base framework using the 3-inch hinges, we can think about the cross stays. These are simply pieces of 2 by 1. Keep the leg upright and square and measure the required distance. Cut each stay in half and use 3 1 1/4 back flap hinges to fix in position. The locking device is made from a 2 by 1 inch offcut secured to one half of the stay by screws and to the other by a removable 5 mm by 3 inch coach bolt and wing nut. In order for the legs to fold neatly on top of each other, one set has to be raised. Use 2 pieces of 4 by 1 by 3 inches for this purpose. You'll note now how nicely the legs fold together on the principle of the right-angled triangle. That's the reason why the 2-foot measurement on both framework and the legs, which I mentioned earlier, was so important. And there you have it, worth all the extra work. A framework which can very easily be put up. It's now ready to start working on at a sensible height. By the way, it's also a nice height to view your layout from. Getting your eye right down to track level gives a much more realistic view, even if it means some younger members of the family will have to stand on the box. With a major part of the woodwork done, we can turn our attention to laying out and marking up the track, and so you can now see quite clearly the full extent of the layout. An important decision here is the amount of space the terminus tracks will occupy. This will determine the position of the main back seam. About 14 inches will be adequate. As far as marking out the track is concerned, this need not to be a work of art, but allow an inch either side. It's a line which we'll cut to later on. To fasten the back seam, we shall need some form of support, and pieces of 2 by 1 offcuts will come in very handy again. They are glued and screwed on the cross members of the frame, about 14 inches in. Remember, this is the width of the track base for the terminus. We shall need a channel to run the electrics through, so bore holes through the cross members. Don't bore holes in the end pieces. Now we can actually fix the board for the back seam, and this is a piece of 4 mm ply previously painted with a light blue matte emulsion. Slots should be cut to fit neatly over the cross members, and when glued and screwed, it becomes an additional strengthening spar. The 14-inch strip of chipboard for the base of the mainline terminus can also now be glued and screwed. There will be a number of points on the layout which will be quite visible even when the scenics are done, and it's going to be neater to sink the point motors into the baseboard. It's very easy to cut out the slots if you drill holes and then use a jigsaw to cut from hole to hole. When we actually put the points in later, it will be necessary to invert the motors so that they fit snugly and level with the baseboard. Suitable instructions for doing this are bound to be included when you buy them. As I said just now, in cutting through the chipboard base, it's easier to drill a few holes at strategic positions and cut between them. Having cut along the pencil marks, which we drew around the track, we'll remove several pieces which will reduce the weight of the layout. The gaps will be filled in later, mostly with polystyrene. What we must do now is drop the level of the track where it intersects with the cross members, and to do this we'll mark up and cut out slots of varying depths. This will give us the 3 levels of track which we require. Remembering that the cross members are 4 inches deep, you'll be able to judge for yourself the depth of the slots required. And if everything goes to plan, the countryside track should fall neatly into place. A word of warning, this is now quite a delicate piece, and unless you take care, it could easily snap in your hands. As this is a fairly complicated structure, it's worth looking at closely to appreciate the stage we've now reached. You can see now how the 3 track levels have taken shape. The figure of 8 crosses over in the center at 2 levels, and we'll cover the gap later with a girder bridge. You can also see the significance of the slots. Let's look at it again from the end-on position. This might be a good time for a little relaxation from carpentry. So let's talk about scenics for a minute or two. We shall be making backdrops from sheets like this. They have a complete range of houses, archways, bridges, and country backdrops. And we shall be using all of these in our model. And this is where the craft knife comes in. But take time to do the fiddly bits, because it'll pay dividends in the long run. The arches which will form the embankments on the mainline terminus are created from similar sheets mounted on modular blocks. Combining the back scene with the arches will achieve a feeling of 3 dimensions. With some of the track down, we can now lay in the points properly. To protect the motor when we cover the area with track ballast, we'll now use masking tape to safeguard the delicate mechanism. We'll get the track firmly down on the base using fine track pins. It's better to use a small hammer. I think we forgot to mention this in our shopping list early on, but I'm sure you'll have one. And we'll finish off with a center punch. And of course, we'll pin the track down over the whole layout before we come to this, polystyrene. Cutting and shaping it nicely may seem complicated, but it's very simple, I can assure you. And this is the solution. A hot wire cutter, perfect for making precise cuts. It's simply a wire connected to a low voltage battery, such as you use in a torch. This will help to create the shapes and contours we need. And the first area we'll start on, because it's perhaps the easiest, is the mainline terminus. And here we'll be placing pieces of polystyrene to build up the embankment, leaving a space over the track, which of course leads in from the other side of the layout. Note how we've modeled the polystyrene on both sides of the curve of the line. We'll use some pieces of suitably shaped cardboard, not only to bridge the gap, but to form a roadway. We shall then add bridge supports, some more arches and houses. The houses are made quite simply from printed fascia sheets. These again are available in kit form and are simplicity itself to assemble. Any little discrepancy where the white shows through can be painted in, or you could paint the corners where the two sections meet before actually sticking the fascias on. We're going to put two bridges on this side, once again constructed in modular form. And now you can see how the track leads through to the other side under the tunnel we've just created with a polystyrene and cardboard. Of course, all this will be glued down into position. Now we can pay some attention to the track itself. Because the track work we use comes already ballasted, all we need to do is put some more ballast in between the tracks. And we have to fix it down permanently. For this, we use a wood glue watered down 50-50. It's a good idea to add a few drops of washing up liquid, which will break down surface tension and help the mixture to penetrate right through the ballast so that every little grain will be firmly fixed. Once it's all dry, we can begin to paint the shiny sides of the rails a dull rust brown using a hobby enamel paint. This will give us a more authentic look. So much for the mainland terminus for the time being. But back at the ranch, as they say, or in our case, back at the countryside, let's fix down the baseboard nicely and firmly. A few little blocks from 2x1 offcuts will support the sheet of 4mm ply, which will form the base to build up the village area. We are going to set it on undulating downs. Once again, we'll use polystyrene to build up the basic shape of the landscape. We'll make the whole area from the plywood upwards removable, so that in the event of a problem or a derailment in the tunnel below, we'll be able to get at it quite easily. If you like, 4 screws sunk through the polystyrene and plywood into the blocks will hold it down safely. It's always a good thought to pop a few things in now and again to get a feel of what's going on. It gives a chance for a rethink, and that's never a bad idea. To fix the layers of polystyrene together, we can use a polystyrene paste, the kind you'd use to fix a ceiling tile, but leave it 48 hours to set. By the way, the buildings here are deliberately Z-gauge, a much smaller scale. They're chosen for the village area to add a greater feeling of depth. They are in fact resin molded and bought just as you see them. Now we need to start thinking about filling in a few of the gaps. And in some areas we can add a rock face or two. And this instant rock strata is really cork bark, which can be obtained from a florist or a hobby shop. Eventually we'll back up the cork bark with a dark cork tile to fill in the irregular gaps. And later on you'll see just how effective this area begins to look. Now it's time to raid the kitchen for a carving knife, because what we're going to do is trim off some of the sharp corners of the polystyrene so that we can begin to create a gentle landscape. This is not a job for the younger members of the family, and in any case, please watch what you're doing. Once we've achieved roughly the shape we want, the next step is to fill in with a ready-mixed plaster from your do-it-yourself shop. The plaster has an interesting texture, and what can be done with it is limited only by your imagination. For example, creating little escarpments and building them into the landscape will give a nice touch. The plaster will take about 24 hours to dry off fully. So in the meantime, let's have a look at the small country junction. And here, Dave is using offcuts of polystyrene coving to hide the corner joints of the two magazines. A very neat idea. Simply stick it on with polystyrene paste and smooth down the edges, which have already been pared down wafer thin with a hot wire cutter. The adjoining angle should also be treated the same way. Now we are well on our way and coming to a point at which the model is beginning to breathe life, because now we're adding grassland and scenery. Having allowed some time for the plaster to dry, the first stage is to camouflage all the white surface with a coating of a light green matte emulsion. And then later on, when we put down scatter material to represent the grass, there is less likelihood of a patch of white glaring through. While the green emulsion is still wet, the first layer of scatter material can be added. This should be coarse. Using a coarse grade at this stage will allow glue to be absorbed later and make adding other layers easier. So, after letting the base dry, moisten with small quantities of diluted glue mix and add a sprinkle of different colors of scatter material for a natural effect. As a final touch, alongside the track, we're going to sprinkle just a little ballast to complete the picture. By the way, remember that grass on the track side may not be very long. However, further into the countryside, the grass will become taller, and by spraying adhesive beforehand, we can puff on a nylon-based green flock. This will give depth to the grass here and there and provide highlights of interest. A very nice effect now is to dab on some polystyrene paste to small areas along the railway cutting. This will give the appearance of chalk faces which might well have been revealed during the formation of the tunnel mouth entrance. It's always particularly nice to have water represented in the model, and we'll incorporate it in the shape of a natural pool. It might appear that Dave has achieved a complicated piece of polystyrene sculpture here, but what it really is 2 layers of polystyrene cut and stuck together. And in much the same way, we can fill in other areas by sticking pieces of polystyrene together. In this case, a little rebate stops it falling through. Bark forms a background to the pool, set against a dark cork tile. The channel created in the polystyrene will eventually take the water. Supports for the viaduct are again cardboard cutouts on plastic modules. The girder bridge is simply a sides-only kit, available commercially and stuck to a piece of cardboard. With a diagonal roadway added where the line disappears into the countryside junction on the right, we can now have a look to see how the model's shaping. Coming into view now, bottom left, are the 3 transformers which we'll use to run the trains. This brings us to a good point to look at the electrical requirements of the layout. A combined transformer controller like this will control one of the three separate circuits. Underneath the layout, we shall install a distribution box leading from the mains supply, and each mains wire from the three controllers will be fed into this junction box. The low-tension wires from each transformer will be fed to and soldered onto the appropriate track, one wire to each rail. It's good practice to wire the negative to a common side of each track, in our case, the inside rails. Also feeding from the junction box, we'll have an auxiliary power supply. This will provide current to the point work. One wire from the auxiliary transformer, you can see it coming in from bottom left, will connect to a common bus bar, a piece of self-adhesive copper tape. From this bus bar, a wire will lead to one side of the solenoid of each point. The second wire will lead directly to an operating probe. Two wires leading from each point will terminate on two brass screws. And simply by touching either of the screws with the probe, will set the point in whichever direction required. In practice, we'll now be able to plan and set up a route very easily. Electrics are not really a mystery, and in our case, they're mainly common sense. But there's one important point to remember, that's isolation. Each of the three tracks must be isolated one from each other. Otherwise, the whole layout would be joined up electrically, and one controller could operate all the three circuits. We can quite simply isolate the three tracks by replacing the metal rail joiners, that's fish plates, with plastic ones, wherever a point joins two circuits together. So you see, electrics are not all that bad, but as I always say with things like this, take a little care. Now back to some scenery. And you can see how Dave has progressed while we've been away. The basic color for the roadway through the village is a mushroom emulsion paint. More rock strata around the hillock, or rather should I say, more wood cork. Once again, still while the emulsion paint is wet, sprinkle on brown and ginger-colored scatter materials. This is nice. Dave's sprinkling the ginger color to represent cart tracks. Then a little green scatter dust to create the remainder of the grass that's not been chewed away by traffic. Very nice. On goes the ruined abbey, and we can now see how Dave has changed his mind on the arrangement of the cottages in the village. Remembering that the viewing position here is from the right of the picture, it's better to have roads leading off into the distance. It gives a nicer perspective. The monument can now be fixed down permanently with neat wood glue, and then with the help of the 50-50 glue mix, we can place the heather around the monument. This is foliage-type scenic material, teased out to give a patchy feel. On the rock strata in the cutting, we can cover the join with lichen. Wood glue is particularly useful for the model maker. Although it's white to start off with, when it goes off, it'll become clear and therefore not show at all. So we needn't worry too much about little dribbles of the stuff. This is now really coming to life. Your observation of nature comes in handy here. After all, vegetation grows about anywhere. A little more attention to the monument now that everything is dry, and at the foot of it, where visitors have stood, we're going to sprinkle a little brown material. And of course, again, we're using our 50-50 glue mix. This old teaspoon of Dave's, or more likely his wife's, certainly does good service. Look at the two visitors to the monument, one taking a quiet rest, probably exhausted walking from the village. Ah, and trees. In one of my previous programs, Shirley Rowe described how to make trees. And of course, you can make your own. These trees are bought and resemble bottle cleaners appropriately colored. But as we're talking mostly about purchased items, I'll not go into tree making right now. Another time, perhaps. The boundary walls are length of Scotch-Brite material. This was bought as a 00 gauge product, and Dave has simply cut it in half down the middle. A very effective walling and very easy to lay down on the undulating terrain. A pin or two will retain it in place until the wood glue dries off. The little halt is positioned temporarily so that the hedgerows behind it can be located and glued down firmly. Later on, the halt can be taken out and station fences and station furniture fitted onto it. Finally, it can be peopled by the odd waiting passenger or two. The wild, uncared-for hedge makes this little country halt seem to have aged naturally out of the countryside. To represent water, David uses one of the commercial resins. When that sets, it'll still have a wet look about it, and the setting time depends on how much hardener is used. Too much will make the resin bubble, too little and it's sticky. So it's well worthwhile experimenting before using it in earnest. Budgerigar grit is an excellent scale version of the smooth stones likely to be found at the bottom of our pool. Long before the resin is poured, it's a wise move to coat the whole base of the pool with a thick layer of almost neat wood glue. This will generally seal off any small gaps. In our case, we had a small hole, so be prepared by laying down some old newspapers. Make sure that the resin floods the pool properly, so that there are no gaps or air bubbles. So far, so good, as far as our countryside is concerned. Now our terminus will need a little attention, I think. The mainline terminus platforms can now be added, and a nice finishing touch here would be an overall glass canopy. Unfortunately, ours didn't arrive in time for the program. Things like this old-fashioned coaling stage, a water tower, and a signal box are all built from kits. They should be suitably weathered with flat enamels, made to run by adding neat terps. With a spot of artistry, it can look very realistic. And with realism very much in mind, let's switch on, sit back, and enjoy it. Well, how's that? A mere winter away from the railway on the floor, but 2 generations in the life of a model maker. A relatively small effort needed to produce a layout which will give joy to you, your family, and friends. Here it is, a slice of the Northeastern Railway, a piece of homemade history, a Deltic and a preserved mallard, sharing the same line. Mind you, all this is just the beginning, and if you like me, you'll want to build more and more. Goodbye for now, until next time.